two of the four key priorities in President Cyril Ramaphosa's State of the Nation address were accelerating economic recovery and implementing economic reforms to create sustainable jobs and drive inclusive growth. This is what my panel will be discussing tonight. What South Africa needs to do to accelerate economic recovery. This as we look forward to the Finance Minister's budget speech. Joining us tonight, Business Unity South Africa President Sipho Pityana, COSATU Parliamentary Coordinator Matthew Parks, Wits University Economic Associate Professor Chris Malikane, as well as Peregrine Treasury Solutions Executive Director Bianca Buertes. Good evening to you all, and thank you very much for joining us tonight on the Newsfeed Late Night. To kick off our conversation, let me begin with you, President of Business Unity South Africa, Sipho Pityana. What are the economic facts, the hard cold facts, the state of South Africa's economy right now, without any assumptions, without any prejudice and conspiracies?
Well, the facts are quite blunt. They are experienced by South Africans every day. We are an economy that's in recession, that is in desperate need of investment. The reality of the matter, notwithstanding the fact that we have, as the President announced, over 772 billion rand of pledges to invest, we remain at 17% below GDP in terms of the rate of investment. In other words, we are not, the investment levels are not at the level at which that will lift and make a meaningful change to these levels of unemployment are excessively high. Certainly, the South African economy is an investable economy. It's an attractive one to investors. Otherwise, you wouldn't have the pledges that one has referred to. The sovereign rating downgrade has had an impact in enterprise rating. A number of companies have similarly been downgraded because of their exposure to South African economy, which means that their ability to raise capital would come at a cost that would be higher than before the downgrading, which means it would make it even more difficult for them to invest in the economy. At the heart of this, of course, is the debate around what we need to do. And we've been discussing and debating this. What is it that we need to do to attract investment? Realizing
we'll get to that part of what we need to do. I just wanted to get a broad view from as many as I could possibly get on the panel tonight on what is the state of our country's economy. Professor Chris Malikane, did the President during his State of the Nation address at least tell us the true picture, the true story, or are there things that he left out?
Well, he did tell the true story. The true story, including issues of rising unemployment. The unemployment rate is trending upwards. The problems of skills in the South African economy, shortages of skills, infrastructure backlogs, and structural problems faced by the South African population in general, particularly issues of inequality and poverty. So he did highlight the actual problems that are facing the South African economy in the State of the Nation address, like it did in the previous ones.
Is your view that we have policies in place for the recovery of our economy, in fact, for even the growth of our economy, it's just poor implementation, or is the state of our economy the way it is because our government has just not been aggressive enough as far as the transformation of the economy is concerned?
It's both. I don't agree that South Africa has got good policies to address the problems that we are facing. In fact, the trajectory of policy that the government has adopted since 1994 has been the one that basically emphasizes the withdrawal of the state in the provision of basic goods and services, and the withdrawal of the state in the economy, the productive sectors of the economy. What we've always said as a neoliberal approach, which has not worked for the South African population. So the policies that he puts in place in the economic recovery plan are not deviating from that. In fact, they are worsening that situation, particularly when you look at the proposals for the structural reforms of SOEs, which are basically dismantling the state capacity to provide goods and services and making way for the private sector to take part in those parts of the state activity where the state is supposed to play a crucial role in addressing developmental issues in the country.
Yeah. Matthew Parks, let's bring you in here. We are, I mean, one would say a small, open economy dependent on imports. I mean, we even import crucial things like inputs into, some of the essential things. And we've seen now with the pandemic, things like PPE had to be imported. And I believe we spent close to about 30 billion rands to bring in PPE in the country, and we couldn't manufacture that locally. I mean, has that always been the case when it comes to the South African economy? And has there been any attempt to move away from that?
Look, I think we're lucky as South Africa, to be honest. With all of our challenges, we have a significantly diversified manufacturing and industrial economy. We are a country which manages a nuclear power station, which hosted a successful soccer World Cup. So there's very little that we can't produce. We have a huge motor manufacturing industry, which actually has been growing. So for us, we're looking for solutions that can save jobs, that can create new jobs, that can boost manufacturing, boost exports. But it requires hard work. It requires commitment from government, from business. It requires all of us, even us as labor, to contribute. So we think on one of the key solutions to saving the economy, to growing it, is the industrial sectoral master plans. We've got 15 of them. Some are doing quite well. They're beginning to take off, like around poultry, around sugar, around motor manufacturing, agriculture. There's some green shoots already. You would have seen recently the 15 billion rand commitment by Ford Motor Company to invest in motor manufacturing of Ford Rangers in Pretoria. That's part of the success of the compacts between government, business, and labor. But there are areas which are very worrying, which we need to do much more work on, like mining, like renewable energy, chemicals, and plastics. Linked to that has to be a concerted local procurement plan. Government, the SOEs, the entities, and municipalities must procure locally. Same with key parts of the private sector, like big mining corporations, other parts of the private sector, but even us as consumers, we should stop looking for cheap Chinese T-shirts when you can produce quality, locally made T-shirts. So it requires all of us to play a part. We think there are opportunities. So, for example, in construction, can we commit to buying locally produced cement? In the fast food industry, can the fast food companies buy locally produced cooking oil? It requires a bit of hard work, some creative thinking, from tariffs to support, to reducing energy charges, etc. But it can be done, and it has to be done. There's a huge amount of money we spent buying cheap imports. And we saw on the example you made about the PPEs last year, that in the beginning, we were buying all our PPEs of very poor quality from overseas, from China, etc. We had a very successful quick intervention by government departments, by colleagues in business, by trade unions in the sectors to turn that around. And quite quickly, we managed to turn the ship around to start procuring locally produced PPEs, masks, the sanitizers, the plastic shields, even the ventilators. So it shows you with a bit of a kick in the backside, we actually can get our act together and start creating local jobs.
All right, Bianca, with a little bit of a kick in our backside, we can actually get this thing moving. Our current economic policy, would you think adequate enough? They just need that kick in the back, and let's implement, and this will be able to turn around. What is your view?
I think a lot of work has been done to improve the current economic policies in play. However, they are not sufficiently implemented and not sufficient enough to actually address the structural shortcomings of the economy. When we are looking at investment from Ford, for instance, yes, it is absolutely spectacular. However, when we start comparing investments coming in versus investments that we've lost over the past couple of years, there's still a massive deficit that needs to be met. Then we haven't even started looking at the government fiscal position and what that means for the economy in the long run.
Now, Professor Chris Malikane, let's bring you here and talk about what Matthew Parks is raising. I mean, these are issues by and large that were also kind of raised by the president. The master plans in automotive. I mean, he even made a huge fuss about 1,000 chickens being procured locally. So localization, one of the areas Matthew touches on. Soft and hard infrastructure, the buying of cement, but also the building of roads. The president saying this is the plan that we are taking. Do we have consensus on those things and the fact that those are the right things to pursue?
Yes, of course. Issues that relate to building local value chains are welcome. I mean, local procurement is crucial. But when you look at the situation of the South African economy, you notice that one of the key factors that inhibit the growth of businesses in various value chains is the issue of access to funding and affordable funding. If you look at chicken, for example, the countries that we compete with, countries like Brazil, you look at Brazil, how they fund their agricultural sector. It's very much developmental, and they get funding directly from their central bank and at 0% interest rate. So that type of funding, developmental funding to boost the private sector to engage in value chains in the economy is what is required in South Africa. That is why I was saying that as long as the macroeconomic framework is not restructured in a developmental way, it's going to be impossible to get the type of massive growth that we would like to see to create jobs and so forth.
So, I mean, what do you make of the argument that, well, the countries that, for example, you're talking about where banks can be able to do that and offer these kinds of loans at zero interest rates have got a huge savings rate and the culture of savings. But not only that, they are largely a domestic market.
No, it's not true, because if you look at Brazil, for example, Brazil was one of the most unequal economies in the world, but by strategic use of their own financial system and social policy and so forth, industrial policy, they managed to actually be competitive in various value chains in the agricultural sector, even in the natural resources sector. You can go to countries like India and learn from there. You know, and also from an economic point of view, it's not true that savings lead to investment. In fact, it's the other way around. It's the credit availability of credit, which is not dependent on savings, which drives investment. And what made credit available is when the banking system sees opportunities where they can fund the private sector. But if there's no demand in the economy and there's no policy that encourages the private sector to venture into areas where they would ordinarily not do, by having the state to lead in areas where there's what you call a market failure, then it becomes impossible for the private sector to extend credit as well. So you need to unlock opportunities through some developmental state interventions.
Right. President of Business Unity South Africa, Sipho Pityana, and Matthew Parks, coordinator for Parliament for COSATU in Parliament, as well as Professor Chris Malekane, associate professor at Wits Business School in Bianca, looking at regulating, or rather at a contribution in the treasury side of things. President of Business Unity South Africa, Sipho Pityana, and we've got Matthew Parks as well, coordinator of Parliament for COSATU, and Professor Chris Malekane, associate professor at Wits for Peregrini Treasury Solutions. We've got Bianca Bortis. And the question we are asking, what are the fault lines in our economy? And what is the state of our economy? How do we kick this up a notch and get to where it needs to be? And of course, there are a number of targets that have been set, and we'll get to them in a moment. But Dr. Pityana, I wanted to address that issue. I mean, there's a question that arises whenever this issue is concerned, the involvement of state in the economy. There are those who are saying there's too much interference of state in this economy, particularly that's a feeling from the private sector. For example, if you're talking about issues like labor relations, if you're talking about issues like the triple BEE policies, and they're saying there's too much interference there, while others are saying, well, the state needs to be there. In fact, it must be even harder.
Well, Thabo, I don't know where that comes from. Certainly, as Business Unity South Africa, we see the state as a very important player in the economy in terms of regulating and directing the economy, particularly given the level of development. In fact, the hard evidence of a positive role that the state can play in the economy is the fact that we have this Ford Motor Company investment in the motor industry. You'll know that Mercedes-Benz made a similar investment. We've seen the motor manufacturing grow over the period since 1994, in large measure because of what is called MIDP, Motor Industry Development Plan, which has seen a number of interventions by the state to enable positive investment in that sector. It's an example of what is possible to do. And our engagements with government have actually been looking at what are the regulatory enabling mechanisms that can be introduced to allow for that to happen in other sectors of the economy. And it needn't manifest in the form of, in the same form as what we see in the motor industry. In the energy sector, for instance, the issue is not Eskom. The issue is enhancing the capacity for energy generation, because without energy, you're never going to be able to grow this economy at required levels. So it's good, you must solve the Eskom problem, but you must realize that there'll never be a time when Eskom will be able to meet the required levels of energy generation that this economy needs to allow for investments and all of that. The same with regard to enabling movement of goods and services, which is transport infrastructure that is dominated by the oligopoly that Transnet is. So keep those there, let them operate and operate efficiently, but crowd in other investments in those sectors to enable other players to come in and generate the requisite capacity and infrastructure to enable the economy to grow.
And what do we,
so it's not either or.
What happens about the jobs?
Certainly.
If the energy generation capacity is outside of Eskom, I mean, already the CEO, Andre de Ruyter, talking about the capacity of Eskom is only at 38,000. Currently, it's sitting at 40,000, saying there needs to be a shedding of jobs there. At the same time, we're saying, well, let's take the generation capacity and take it outside. What's going to happen to those jobs?
Well, imagine if you had a system where you actually had multiple generators of electricity and multiple transmitters of energy, wouldn't be having that debate, because they would have options elsewhere. So these are people who are skilled, who've been exposed to energy generation and all of that, and done tremendous work at Eskom. It may be that given where Eskom is, their excess capacity, but we certainly need those skills, because clearly we have serious energy shortages in the country. Yeah. We need people who are able to be engaged in that activity elsewhere beyond Eskom. So my point is that, in the same way that we've seen in other jurisdictions with restructuring of previous state-owned entities, it isn't inevitable that you have displacement of skills of jobs. In some sectors, in some situations, you have. In others, you actually have had those entities grow and activities in those sectors grow in multiple fold and actually promote and enhance employment opportunities.
And Matthew Parks, I want you to respond to that. I mean, if there are options, those workers at Eskom will have more places to go and plow their skills, so to speak.
Yeah, look, I think, for example, on the Eskom issue, we had drafted the Eskom social compact because we realized we're heading for a brick wall. We couldn't afford for Eskom to collapse like SA or SA Express collapsed, because Eskom is in essence our generator and distributor and transmitter of electricity. It provides more than 95% of our electricity capacity. We needed to succeed. And part of our social compact agreement was that no worker should be retrenched. If, for example, Eskom could say it has, after doing a headcount or skills audit, it has surplus staff, we could look at redeploying staff within Eskom to different divisions where there might be a shortage, or even to municipal electricity departments. But the point is that when you have an economy at 50% unemployment, we can never afford to send a single worker home unemployed. But equally, we know many of the power stations are coming to the end of the lifespan. So we need to have a just transition plan for those power stations, for those workers and those communities. We can't afford to have anyone going home without food to take care of the family. So we need to have a just transition that looks at, can we extend the power station's lifespan, or can we create new jobs? Can we build solar panel factories locally, especially in the coal belt in Mpumalanga, in Limpopo, but even, for example, in the Transkei in the Northwest, historical mining labor centers. So we need to create as many jobs as we can. We need to be creative how we do it. And so investing in renewable energy technology production locally, seeing how we can create new opportunities, new export opportunities is central to that. What we've had in the past is that when jobs are lost, whether it's from government or from business, we've simply said those workers are on their own, and we really need to shift that mindset. We must have a spirit of a social compact at all times, which is government, business and labor, we're going to work together to make sure we leave no worker behind, we leave no family behind. We look at how to create job opportunities, because really we can't afford to lose a single job.
Yeah. Bianca, let's look at the target set by the National Planning Commission, right? By 2025, they're targeting unemployment to be at 8.6%, and by 2030, unemployment to be sitting at 6%. Is that target achievable in the trajectory and in the way that we are progressing right now?
We just start looking at where we are currently, sitting at 38% unemployment. Looking at that moving target, looking at the unemployment amongst the youth, looking at our lacking in job creation, the sluggish economic growth, and the fact that we are actually falling behind in our debt to GDP ratios, increasing warnings from the ratings agencies, it is problematic to actually see that in a realistic light. Private sector as well as government will really have to hold hands and make sure that we are creating not only job opportunities, but also legislation that is conducive to those job opportunities, that's dynamic enough to adjust with the economy. One of the biggest issues that we see, particularly in small businesses, is basically the inability for legislation to amend with the economic cycle. So we sit with small businesses who are unable to amend their workforce, to relocate the workers, and we actually see them go under. Moneymark or MoneyWeb had an article published of 75,000 small companies closed down. And those are the type of companies that create jobs in South Africa. Those are the type of entities that we should be supporting.
Yeah. Well, Professor Chris Malekane is saying those are the type of companies that can't access the loans and the funding. The way that the banks in South Africa are structured currently, would a state bank then assist in this instance?
We've actually looked at the government guarantee scheme, loan guarantee scheme throughout COVID, and they've done a spectacular job in making that funding available to businesses. However, the biggest constraint remains that businesses in South Africa does not necessarily have the available collateral, nor do they necessarily have the strong balance sheets that banks often require in terms of their credit processes. Yeah. There's definitely room to start looking at how government can assist in funding that. However, we need to bear in mind the fiscal position of the government, as well as the fact that they recently withdrew from guarantees from the Land Bank. So do they really have the capacity to underwrite additional debt to the market?
But is that not precisely the issue then, Bianca, that as you're putting it, a huge number of those businesses, I think the uptake was something below 20% of that guarantee loan scheme, because a number of the businesses just couldn't afford, they didn't have the collateral, they just didn't have that kind of backing to be able to take that loan.
That's absolutely the problem. And as Professor Chris pointed out rightfully, is that so many businesses are struggling to keep head above water. Working capital in South Africa is extremely expensive to access. And once you get to a point where you need to start choosing between paying your workers or keeping your lights on in the factory, that becomes a very hard choice for a business owner. And where do you draw that line? The government needs to come to the party more robust and say, this is how we are going to assist you, without putting rigorous restraints on those businesses. Some of the conditions attached to some of the COVID funding loans were so rigorous that it was impossible for small businesses in particular to meet those demands in order to access finance.
Taking stock of our economy, the economy under the spotlight tonight as we take a look at what needs to happen to drive the economy to the levels where it is growing, at least at 5%, which is the target that has been set for 2025, even more for 2030, according to the National Planning Commission. You've been responding to this. Let's have a look at what you're saying on WhatsApp tonight to our conversation. Right, this is on Twitter. Our economy will never be improved, Thabo, since our government is full of corruption. Look how many things happened since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. NC members stole money and Ramaphosa knows about it. For me, let's give another party a chance, I suppose. Maybe we will see the difference in South Africa. Innocent in Richards Bay. All right. We'll get to more of those in just a moment. And of course, we'll bring back our panel to that conversation as well. The target, as you look at the National Planning Commission, GDP growth for 2025 should be growing at about 4.8%, in 2030 by 5%. That is what they're setting as a target. But are these targets realistic? And of course, that is the question. Professor Chris Malekane, we're not hearing the president now mention the question of a state bank, which is something that he mentioned, I suppose, a couple of sonas ago. But one would say, well, that's not his priority right now. His priority, I suppose, is COVID and the recovery of the economy. But is a state bank really the solution?
Well, it is part of the institutions that need to exist in a developmental state. If you look at what we call models of developmental state, they don't exist without a strong state bank or the state's role in the system. Basically, the state is largely involved in these institutions, whose is, by the way, problematic, not in line with the developmental fund model that you find in normal developmental state. So he did not talk about the state bank, he did not talk about the sovereign wealth fund, etc., which is an issue that should be of concern because there needs some equity in calculation.
All right, Prof, we seem to be losing you on that line. We'll try and make another connection to you so that we can get you a little bit clearer. Dr. Pikiane, the banks are the problem in the business space, particularly if you're looking at smaller businesses that want to access funding. Do you share that sentiment?
Well, the debate about banks is a debate about access to finance and access to investments to turn the economy around. The reality of the matter is that South Africa, as I indicated earlier on, is an attractive investment destination and should have ease of access to capital. We just need to unlock the critical sector. So the growth ambitions articulated in the National Development Plan, in my view, once upon a time looked quite reasonable. You'll recall that business supported the National Development Plan. So, for instance, Matthew quite correctly makes the point that we have a social compact with the Labour government and community constituencies in NEDLEC around ensuring that we fix ESCOM and we ensure that it is fit for purpose. But I will go beyond that and say to you that if you look at our integrated energy plan that we agreed much earlier, it suggests that the energy sector is one of the most attractive investment destinations. So if you unlock that, you would have immense investment that goes there, that will be crowded in there, that would enable the economy. So the point that one is making is that a lot of these suggestions are not novel. We've had these debates over and over and over again. The reality of the matter is that we have a plethora of development finance institutions that are exactly intended to enable financing of the marginalized or being catalysts in enabling certain sectors of the economy that are strategic to open up and crowd in investors. And these have not functioned in the way that was intended. In fact, their credit systems are not very different quite often from those of mainstream banks. So anytime anybody makes a suggestion about establishment of yet another state-owned entity, I just pull my hair off, because we are sitting with serious dearth of skills in that environment. We are sitting with serious challenges in managing what we have of state-owned entities before we even begin to propose additional ones.
Now, on the other side of that argument is the fact that we are already sitting with a number, maybe not a huge number, but a substantial number of major corporate companies that are having outside shareholding, investors that you're talking about. But this has not had the ability to accelerate the fundamental change that we want to see.
Well, if you look at the telecoms industry, I mean, if we took the same approach with regard to that industry, telecom would be the sole player in that sector. Wouldn't be having a Vodacom, wouldn't be having an MTN, wouldn't be having a Neotel, etc., etc. With all those changes, telecom has survived. In fact, it has improved its operations. It is competing with these. Yes, jobs have been lost there, but those in the telecom sector have benefited with the introduction of the new ones. We hope that with the introduction of spectrum, that sector will grow even more. So I think that what we need to be focusing on, and this is where the real setback is, in my view, from in where we are today. We actually are operating in an environment of a policy vacuum. It was correct and appropriate in the past to say that we're good at policies and short on implementation. It looks like we're in an even worse situation today, because actually it's not clear what our policy direction is with regard to the direction of the economy. That's what is the biggest problem, actually.
Professor Chris Malikane, bring you back. Hopefully we've got a little bit of a better line there. What do we need to do to fix our public finance? I think a lot of the rating agencies are looking at the Minister of Finance to give a speech next week, and they want to hear that he's sticking to message. He is continuing on the path of fiscal consolidation, making sure that we're cutting back on expenditure, but generally fixing our public finance, which is in a precarious position at the moment.
It's funny because you want to grow the economy, but you're cutting back government spending, which means that you're cutting demand. So there's something fundamentally wrong in the economics of that. So what needs to happen is that there needs to be a complete overhaul in the rethink of how you fund government and how you fund development in South Africa. As I mentioned before, there is a huge role that needs to be played by the financial system. And if you go back to the apartheid system, you had prescribed assets, which were basically funds that were made available for developmental purposes, the building of roads, the building of water infrastructure, rail, and so forth, at affordable interest rates for government. You have the role of the central bank, because remember, the central bank creates money out of nothing, like banks do. So the central bank has a huge role in funding infrastructure rollout, and addressing the historical backlogs, because sometimes we lose sight of the fact that we are not just dealing with a narrow economic problem here, we're dealing with a socio-economic crisis that we've inherited from the past. So we can't use market-based instruments all the time to resolve these problems. They were created deliberately by a state policy, and they require a deliberate state policy to reverse. And the many countries that have reversed these legacy problems have actually used unconventional ways and aggressive ways in doing that.
Yeah, Bianca, the activists, there you are, calling for aggressive redistribution, saying, in fact, the other instruments that should be used are the monetary policy instruments. I mean, that creates a whole lot of debate whenever that question is raised. I mean, what is our understanding of how the central bank can be used in this instance?
What we've seen, especially through the pandemic, is that the South African Reserve Bank actually started intervening in the bond market. And a lot of people would view that as quantitative easing. However, the Reserve Bank went and they defined it and said it was merely to bring stability to the bond market and not seen as quantitative easing in support of the economy. The South African Reserve Bank mandate clearly states that the Reserve Bank is responsible for price stability and inflation rate targeting, making sure that we stay in a band of 3 to 6%. There's been a lot of debate as to how the central bank can assist in stimulating the economy. What we need to be wary of, however, the more money we print, the more money goes into circulation, the more we devalue our currency. And at the end of the day, you can create a monster, what we've seen in Zimbabwe, where your money becomes absolutely worthless because there is no limitation as to how much we are printing. There is no limitation into how much government gets to embezzle, throw away, malspend, because they know that the central bank will always be that backstop in order to bail them out. So while there are two schools of thought here, and maybe a combination of the two is where we will find middle ground eventually, purely looking towards the central bank to fund an economy is not the way to go. South Africa currently is fully taxed. We've got unemployment of 38%. We haven't seen reform come through from a government perspective. So as was pointed out a bit earlier in this debate, we do have significantly good policies that is being flogged to the nation, that is being sold to investors. But once it comes down to implementation, we fall short. And we've seen that repeatedly. We are addressing the same issues over and over in budget. We are addressing the same issues over and over in SONA. And we actually need to get to the point where we say, okay, we are now not going to talk about it anymore, but we are going to take action and implement it. Because only once we implement these policies will we actually start seeing that reform. And it cannot be solely on the shoulders of government, and it cannot be solely on the shoulders of private sector.
Yeah. Matthew Parks, what is your view as COSATU on the central bank's role in injecting some life into the economy? I mean, many say we are endowed, I suppose that's what I'm picking up in this conversation as well, with human capital. We are endowed with a possibility of building infrastructure. We just need some money there. Maybe that's what needs to happen. Central bank print some more money so that we can pay for these things, and these will stimulate the type of growth that we need.
Yeah. Look, I think, ironically, we were quite pleased with the role the Reserve Bank played in the past year. That is exactly the type of action we've been calling for many years. Because, look, we've been in an economic crisis long before any of us had ever heard of COVID-19. Before the lockdown in March last year, unemployment was already at 40%. So the actions we've been calling for as COSATU has been about lowering interest rates, not in a reckless way, but in a way which can help release credit into the economy, make it more affordable for consumers, for workers, and for businesses, not in a crude, reckless way, but in a way which supports growth. We felt in the past they've been a little bit too stringent, especially because inflation has been very low and very stable. It's been long been within the 3 to 6% band. So this space, we were welcomed when the Reserve Bank last year bought government bonds to help, as Bianca was saying, put some quantitative easing into the economy. Those are the kind of things we think they need to continue to do. We had actually were quite disappointed in the last Monetary Policy Committee meeting a few weeks ago in January, when we felt they could have reduced the repo rate by another 25 basis points. There is significant space. And every time you reduce it, you provide capital into the economy. You make it easier for consumers to pay their debts to where they borrow, to spend money in the local economy. You help restaurants and other small companies stay open to avoid retrenchments. But I think also the private commercial banks also have to come to the party, because the Reserve Bank has got certain limitations. It can't do everything. It must protect and manage inflation, because if you allow inflation to get out of control, the first person to suffer will be workers, with the small little wages being eroded. But equally, the Reserve Bank has to also look at measures to support economic growth. It can't just be looking at inflation. It must also look at job creation, stimulating the economy. But the commercial banks too have been far too rigid about the excessive interest rate they charge to consumers, to businesses, etc. They've been far too bureaucratic and conservative about lending to companies which want to emerge. And we've seen the consequence of that with the loan guarantee scheme. That was meant to provide 40% of the economic recovery package last year. But to date, out of the 200 billion rand that was meant to be provided to the economy, to struggling companies, only 18 billion rand has been provided so far. And that's simply because the commercial banks have been far too stringent. Equally, Treasury has not been agile enough to respond to issues. So we really need to see from those parts, what can they do? Because government can do so much, the Reserve Bank could do so much, the Unemployment Insurance Fund can do so much, and really the largest amount of funds available, not in a reckless way, but in a sustainable way, are from the commercial banks.
All right, Matthew Parks, appreciate it. Stay with us. Sibo Pikiana, I want you to take a bite at this question of how do we fix our public finances. Let's go to WhatsApp and see what you've been saying tonight. Temba in Cape Town saying the president after president, SONA after SONA, and speech after speech, we are told about job creation and economy recovery plans, but implementation dololo. Into abayazi kukuchonja. Okay. Mohali in Pretoria saying the government has no clue on how to revive the economy. They are just looting in every sector of the country. Sakhale is saying, what are the impacts of labor policies on growth or not of the South African economy? All right. Matthew, just note that question because I'm going to put that to you in just a moment. But it seems from our viewers there's this question of corruption in the state in particular, but also fixing our public finances is the big question. Rapikane, just take a bite at that. And what is your take on how we fix public finance, and also how do we, in real terms, not forming another council to sit and decide on what should happen to people who are corrupt?
I think that one of the things that we've really not addressed urgently, and we've been at it with government that we need to move with speed to address, is the capacity of the state. There's a relationship between the levels of corruption and capacity of the state. In fact, the capacity of the state has been oozed out by deployment of people without requisite qualifications, competencies, and all of that, so that the ability of the corrupt to access state funds in an illicit fashion is pursued unfettered. And unless you fix that, the wasteful expenditure, corruption, and stealing that happens with every good and well-intended project will continue unabated. So one of the key and critical issues that has to happen is to fix that. And there are simple ways to address that without having to establish yet another commission or a committee or anything like that. We just need political will to take appropriate action. Let me give you an example. The Public Service Commission files to Parliament year in, year out, the number of people that are in key strategic positions in government that have been appointed irregularly, that shouldn't be there, that don't have the qualifications. And we know that that's a statutory body. Parliament has those reports, the executive has those reports, and those people stay. The Auditor General follows up with reports that say that the finances of municipalities and provinces, et cetera, are in a palace state because people who are supposed to watch the purse in finance department and procurement and all of that don't have requisite qualifications. With all those reports, there isn't the political will to actually remove those people. You don't need to have a commission of inquiry to deal with that. You just need to have political will to deal with that. You have people that are known to have stolen and are active in the state system in siphoning off resources. Government it shouldn't be just joining the chorus of anti-corruption. It should act as a state in power and act decisively against corruption.
Matthew Parks, what are the current Labour policies contributing or not contributing to the state of the South African economy?
Yeah, look, I think they help us to provide for labour market stability. If you have an absence of decent labour laws or protections for workers, then you do get labour market instability. We often do hear some colleagues in business saying, well, the labour legislation is a cause of unemployment, which is not true. These laws are relatively new from 1994, yet we had unemployment long before 1994. And the laws are basically saying, can mine workers go to work without dying? Can workers be guaranteed some level of protection from harassment at work, or if they get into a disciplinary issue, they can't just be fired without due process? We have seen when employers wanted to fire workers, they did so quite easily. The laws are fairly simple, fairly logical. It is useful to have labour market stability. We saw when you don't have labour market stability, what happened at Lawman, tragically, about 8 years ago. So it's critical to having it. For us, why we don't have jobs being created, why companies struggle to survive, is, as Sipo was saying, you have huge amounts of corruption, you have declining quality of infrastructure, poor roads, inadequate supply of reliable and affordable electricity. You have regulatory blockages to companies to do business. So, for example, it takes mining companies about 3 years to get a water license. So those are the kind of obstacles to economic growth. Equally, we also have to look at, in a globalized economy, what can we do to make businesses, industries, sectors more efficient? So we lose lots of jobs in poultry and sugar because of the dumping of subsidized imports from Brazil, etc. What can we do to make the poultry industry more productive? Can we lower energy costs? Can we make irrigation more affordable? Can we invest in the training of workers to make them more skilled and productive? So I think for us, we have to look at the hard issues and not look for simple scapegoats. We shouldn't be blaming farm workers for wanting a decent wage for the challenges of subsidized agriculture in Europe and dumping in South Africa. We should look at the actual cause of the problem and find the real solutions. But paying people slave wages, treating them like slave labor, As under apartheid, that's not a solution for workers or for the economy.
On a question of the water license, have you engaged your partners? Did you engage the president, which I know you supported on his way to the presidency, on that issue of the water license? Last time he promised that this will be an issue that is behind us. In fact, he said water licenses will now be approved in 90 days. Has that happened?
No, it hasn't. In fact, Sipho would know that we've sat together many meetings shouting at government on precisely those simple issues. And for us, that's really a typical example. We shouldn't have to take a year or 2 years raising a simple issue like that, of saying, can we sort of water licenses? It shouldn't take even 90 days, it should take 30 days. Those are really non-issues. But the fact that is we have a huge capacity problem, often in government leadership, in departmental leadership, where non-issues become obstacles to economic growth. So when you see, for example, positive changes. So for example, last year, the Minister of Trade and Industry set up a wonderful online portal system where companies can register one day online in real time with SARS, with the Unemployment Insurance Fund, with the compensation funds. Those are the practical solutions we like to see. But to be honest with you, all too often in many departments, there's a real sense of lethargy, of inefficiency in the leadership of government around passing legislation, around passing regulations, around responding to simple issues. And honestly, it's a waste of our time when they should be dealing with those issues quickly. Those are low-hanging fruits. It can help unlock economic growth quite quickly if they are serious about it.
Professor Chris Malikana, very quickly, I think we've got just under a minute. The question of quantitative easing, devaluing the currency.
Actually, it's an erroneous way of thinking about QE. Actually, I mean, where QE has been implemented, currencies have not depreciated. In fact, they've strengthened. And the reason is simply that when the central bank buys government bonds, it lowers long-term interest rates, and the impact of that is to increase asset prices. And in anticipation of the increase in asset prices, then investors flock into the economy and basically buy equities in that economy, and that strengthens the currency. So what was mentioned about QE is actually wrong. And just to highlight lastly, to say that lowering the interest rates in the context of such a huge drop in aggregate demand is not going to assist in driving credit in the economy. What you need now is actually the central bank quantitatively providing credit to entrepreneurs. Lowering the interest rate and hoping that the private sector is going to simply roll out credit is not going to work.
All right, we're out of time. Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there for our debate tonight. Let me thank you all for joining us. President of Business Unity, South Africa, Sipho Pityane, Coordinator for Parliament for COSATU, Matthew Parks, and Professor Chris Malikana, Associate Professor at Wits University, and Peregrine Bianca Botis. Much appreciated, and thank you very much for joining us as well, and for sharing your views and your thoughts on Twitter as well as on WhatsApp.